Now, the reopening of schools will not be a switch-on, switch-off affair. Words by Education Cabinet Secretary Professor George Magoha as pressure continues to mount on the government to give direction on the reopening of schools. Well, in 2 days' time, on the day initially planned to be the school's opening date, the National COVID-19 Education Committee is expected to officially hand over its report to the CS Education. This report, coupled with recommendations from the Ministry of Health, will inform the government's decision on when to reopen schools, what to put in place before that happens, and how to regain the lost time for learners. On this edition of the Front Row, we'll look at the disruptions in the education sector and what it would take to bring it back on course. Thank you for joining us. My name is Akisa Wandera, and you can always join us on this conversation to be part of this edition of the Front Row. Send your questions by logging into slido.com. Enter event code as #TheFrontRow. We're also available on Twitter at KTNNewsKE, at Akisa Wandera. Use the #TheFrontRow. And here now are our panelists for this conversation. We begin with Dr. Githinji Gitahi, who is the Global Chief Executive Officer of AMREF Health Africa. Until his appointment to AMREF Health Africa, Dr. Gitahi was the Vice President and Regional Director for Africa, Smile Train International. Prior to that, he was Managing Director for Monitor Publications in Uganda, as well as General Manager for Marketing and Circulation in East Africa for the Nation Media Group. He held senior positions at GlaxoSmithKline and worked at the Avenue Group and the insurance industry. Dr. Gitahi is a co-chair of the UHC 2030 Steering Committee, a global World Bank and World Health Organization initiative for universal health coverage. He's a member of the board for various companies, and tonight he'll be bringing the expertise in the health sector on how we move forward, even as we take a look at when exactly do we reopen schools and what needs to be put in place as far as that is concerned. Second, we have Dr. Lucy Wakiaga, an education consultant and a seasoned educator with both local and international experience in early childhood, primary school, high school, and higher education, with a special focus on policy and educational administration. Currently, she's a research associate and senior lecturer at the School of Arts and Social Sciences, Tangaza University College here in Nairobi, bringing us a vast experience from all stages of education in the country. Now, finally, we have Honorable Wilson Sossion, the Secretary General of the Kenya National Union of Teachers, NAT. He's also a nominated Member of Parliament of the Orange Democratic Movement, representing workers' interests in the National Assembly. He has a wealth of experience in teaching and trade unionism in the education sector. Of course, we'll be bringing the trade union perspective as well as the legislative perspective into this conversation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us tonight here as our panelists in this conversation. Now, let's quickly take a look at the number of recommendations that have been made. We've seen various recommendations on what needs to be put in place for the education sector to move forward after this disruption. From March 15th, students have been out of school. We saw NAT, KMPDU, the Kenya National Human Rights Commission, and other bodies come up with recommendations that they presented to the National Committee on Emergency Response Committee on COVID-19. But we also have bits of recommendations made by the Dr. Sarah Ruto-led committee, which is the COVID-19 Education Committee, that is expected to hand over its report to Professor George Magoha in 2 days' time. So I'd quickly want us to go through the NAT recommendations and compare them to what we saw in the interim report handed over to Professor George Magoha on Friday. NAT, MPDU and the other bodies proposed that schools should reopen earliest in September, push national examinations to first quarter of 2021, change or revision of the school calendar. They are also proposing that the curriculum to resume from point of coverage, that was from March 15th when schools were closed, drop all co-curriculum activities because they're not a priority now, a stimulus package for the education sector as well, among the things that NAT is proposing as must-do or must-haves before we decide to reopen schools. And looking at the bits where we're looking at the environment for learners, 15 learners per class in respect to social distancing, 1.5 meters, more classes, generally infrastructure, chairs, desks, constant supply of running water. We see this in the interim report shortly as well, as they're also proposing, providing masks and PPEs for teachers, learners, and every other stakeholders involved in this, provision of soap, among other recommendations. So then, we got bits of the recommendations that the task force made in the interim report that was presented before or to Professor George Magoha. Let's quickly take a look at those recommendations before we get into the conversation here. There were bits and pieces that we were able to gather from our sources. And of course, in 2 days' time, we'll see the full recommendations from the task force. Let's take a look at what that is from what we were able to gather. They equally propose schools to reopen in September. September is very key. And Dr. Githinji will be telling us, as well as Dr. Sosion, who was part of this, on why September is key in both these recommendations. National examinations to be done not earlier than February 2021, to adopt proactive measures on learners' health, face masks for all students, perhaps the same thing we see in the NAT recommendations. They're also talking about the training of teachers as well as students on how business will not be done as usual, different things that they're going to see, perhaps how to take a look at their health measures even when they engage in their activities. So those are some of the recommendations from the task force. Ensure public health hygiene induction on the use of PPEs, as I've already mentioned, and proper equipment to be delivered in all the schools in the country, temperature guns being inclusive of that. So those are some of the various recommendations we've gotten so far on what needs to be done before schools reopen. Our panelists will be weighing in on this and perhaps what more they think. What should we remove? What should we add on top of this, even as we await the recommendations from the task force? And before we get to that, President Uhuru Kenyatta now wants the Ministry of Education to engage stakeholders and collaborate with the Ministry of Health to issue guidelines for the possible reopening of schools. So what kind of measures would be needed before the schools reopen? Here now is Shadrach Miti with those insights.
For nearly 3 months, learning institutions have remained closed. The government has been engaging various stakeholders on how to reopen schools and colleges. And President Uhuru Kenyatta wants the process expedited.
I am hereby directing that the Ministry of Education fast-tracks and finalizes the ongoing consultations with all stakeholders that will provide us with an appropriate calendar for the gradual resumption of education in the country.
With a student population of more than 5,000 learners, Kenya Technical Trainers College remains a major center in the training of technical trainers for TVET institutions across the country. With COVID-19 came the closure of the college. Social distancing will obviously be a big dilemma. However, the management believes enhanced e-learning is the solution. And although it is not yet clear on when learning will resume, preparations for the return of students are in high gear. Sanitizers, running water, and soap are key in combating COVID-19. James Kimomi is a lecturer and head of innovations at KTTC. Alongside his students, he has been working on this automated water and soap dispenser. It's an innovation born out of necessity.
It is like a one-stop facility. You put your hands, water flows, you get to the soap, you clean yourself, then you get back to the tap and you sense and the water comes out and you remain clean.
It is an idea that came from a technical student. The Innovations Office thought it wise to bring on board students from other departments.
These machines, the design comes from mechanical departments. Electronics part comes from electrical department. And the ICT part comes from computer studies department.
We will have one at the gate. Then we will have 1 or 2 or 3 at strategic places in the field. Then at the dining hall, we will put a few.
The automated hand washing machine is largely made from used electronics and electrical parts. The machine is part of measures the college is putting in place ahead of reopening, in line with the Ministry of Health protocols.
We need to protect our children and our trainees. We will be able to manufacture or come up with very many samples of this and even boost our production unit and sell to other institutions.
Shadrach Miti, KT News.
Let's now bring in our panelists. Perhaps start with you, Wilson Sossion, speaking from NAT and having already made a very conclusive report on some of the recommendations you expect. We see some of them are similar to what was presented before the CS in the interim report. I mean, what do you think about these two recommendations? And from where you sit in 2 days' time, what should we expect?
Yes, the recommendations from NAT, WASU, KMPDU, Kenya Human Rights Commission, and FAWE, and that interim report of Dr. Sarah Ruto are a replica, basically because the advice is drawn from medical doctors. Whether you get doctors from Kenya, South Africa, wherever, the findings and pieces of advice shall, of course, definitely be the same. And at this moment, we are very grateful that then, looking at the different thinking by the different groups, it converges at one common and central understanding. And now that the president has given a directive, and I think as Kenyans, we should salute and congratulate the President of the Republic. Because unlike other governments where a lot of force and coercion has been used in reopening of schools, ours is more democratic, fair, and it basically relies heavily on the expert advice of medical doctors through the Ministry of Health and those practicing privately. So according to me, from where I sit, considering the report that we've developed comprehensively and handed over to the National Emergency Response Command Committee, and that interim of Dr. Sarah Ruto is actually one and the same, because one, the date of reopening of schools has been slated for September in both reports.
Yes.
And this takes into consideration the current context of the trend of the disease in the country, that it is still growing, and that the medical experts are telling us that the peak of this corona will be the month of August and September. And drawing from international experience, nations that have succeeded in resuming learning in the learning institutions are those that have managed to flatten the curve. So definitely, if the peak of the spread of corona will be the month of August and September, then it means it shall not have been flattened. And the advice we are getting is that from the medics is that we can only resume learning and students can begin trooping back to school in a skillful and meticulous and phased out manner, only when the curve shall have been flattened. And if we force resumption of learning, even with the health protocols in place, and we have seen global experience, enforcing social distance among the learners is completely difficult within schools. Even McHugh, majority of the learners are day scholars. Children are children, and they herd together.
Yes.
That herding instinct is a common characteristic of learners. And even if we enforce within the compounds, we may not enforce when they leave school. And there is a likelihood that reopening of schools at this point, from the medical expert advice, is that it is going to worsen the spread of the disease, and we might have more deaths, thousands of deaths by August. So I think the two reports from where is it are similar, and it draws from the experience of medical doctors. And we congratulate the medical doctors of this country for advising all parties. And we want to believe this is what is going to inform the government on what to do when to open schools, how to open, and what protocol measures must be put in place.
And we're glad we have Dr. Githinji with us to just expound on that matter of the peak of infections, and then at what point do we decide that we can reopen schools. Dr. Githinji, please weigh in on that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Isa, and thank you to Sosion for elaborating the report. So for me, I'll not comment on the report because I have not gone through it. I don't know the recommendations. So I'll just give my own personal view from a public health point of view. And all the things that Sosion have said, make sense. What I would like to reflect on is that first, the cases are going up, and they're going to go up until about September or so is the projections we have. But remember that the virus is always several steps ahead of you. So any modeling you do is as good as the assumption that you make. So for now, the assumptions we have are not, you cannot, hold the people model accountable if the cases continue beyond September or they tip down before September. The model is based on certain assumptions. So assuming that those assumptions are correct, then we expect the peak to be around end of August, September, in which case then we can start to say, and we have seen this across many countries, that it may be the time to start thinking about opening schools. But remember that at the end of the day, it is really the critical thing to consider is the safety of the learners, the safety of the teachers and the school community, and the safety of the households from where these children come from and where they go. So those are the things we need to consider. Therefore, as we consider that safety element, then we have to ask ourselves, are we ready? So whereas the government, the Ministry of Education, and the stakeholders who have been consulted, because this is really critical to consult stakeholders to build trust, we must then think about several points. So maybe I would just like to highlight several things that we need to think about.
Yes.
And I hope they have been considered. One is to consider that safety that I've talked about. And that safety means that you have to think about several things in the school. One is the capacity to actually have the children in there while maintaining social distance. What you've seen in some countries is they have actually staggered and started with maybe upper classes. Some countries have kind of done partial opening, as I've mentioned. Others have done kind of some grades come on Monday, some grades come on Tuesday, some grades come on Thursday, kind of deferred return to school. And others have just said we are going to wait until this is over, countries like Italy and many states in the US as well. The other thing that we need to consider as we go back is that when we are going back, and I hope Dr. Sian and the team that was looking at this has considered this, that it shouldn't be business as usual when we return. The recommendation that I personally would make is that in the first instance, in the first week or so of learning, we should not go back to the ordinary curriculum. We should actually create a special module on COVID-19 to talk to the students and to the young learners that actually this is what you've experienced, share your experiences. Have you been harmed by this in any way? Mental health, their psychosocial support. What experiences do you have from your family? Some of them, remember, are coming from families that had people who are probably tested positive. So you need to pay attention to that, pay attention to what experiences they're having, what they expect, and the future outlook of COVID. And that should be a module. For me, I would recommend that the schools prepare, the Ministry of Education prepares, and should be ready before we reopen. And that should be the focus in the first week or so, including training a number of teachers across the learning institutions to be able to offer psychosocial support to the learners when they come back. So to go back to the curriculum would be to assume that things are normal, and yet they are not. The final point I want to make as we prepare to go back is to ensure that I would hope that the committee has a full list of water and sanitation facilities in schools. We know many schools across the country may not have access to running water and sanitation. Has that been established by the committee to make sure before we reopen in September, we are delaying so that we ensure every school has adequate water and sanitation facilities to ensure hygiene continues. And I talked about earlier about social distancing. And the final point is teachers and community and school community members who are at risk. We have known that the infection is not really the problem, because when you have a virus that says that's new, many people are susceptible. All of us are susceptible, and we may get infected at one time or the other. The people who worry us are the people who are at risk, especially those above 60, especially those with comorbidities or with hypertension, diabetes, another thing that may put them at risk.
Yes.
I hope there is a consideration to ensure they are not going back to school and they are identified and they are told to stay at home, because that is really what we need to worry about, not only the infection, but putting people at risk, and we need to consider those things before the reopening.
All right, Dr. Githinji, you've outlined a number of points, and I'm sure our panelists will be weighing in on that. Dr. Wakiaga, you're a consultant, you're a researcher, but you also train. Being a trainer and looking at the conversation on reopening of schools, what worries you the most? What do you expect to see in the report that comes out in 2 days?
Good evening, Akisa, and thank you for having me. Just to add on to the conversation that is ongoing from Mr. Sosion and Dr. Githinji, when we look at the spread of the virus and what is going on, there's a lot that still needs to be done, and it's been enumerated. But for me, I want us the discussion for us to look at it from a bigger perspective. Let us not lose the forest and focus on the trees. So in my perspective, what I would suggest is that as we are thinking about opening in September or whatever time has been suggested, what I would say is we even need to start thinking about now. We need to think about how are we preparing now, not having plans in place and for opening in September. Rather, we should start having measures in place that are ongoing. For example, if I look at, if we are talking about the issue of how do we then create more awareness, because issues have been talked about, stigma and all that. And we know how our children are, how they are social. We are also social beings as adults. And even right now, as the government is putting efforts in place to try and contain the virus, but we still see the numbers rising, and we can see areas that are on lockdown, and we have a lot of, still the numbers are increasing in those areas. So even at that point, we see that we still have challenges. So what does that mean then for us? It means there's still a lot of awareness that has to be created. You know, when you walk around and you see are people putting on masks? Are they observing hygiene, social distancing, and all that? Those are challenges that are already, they are still exhibited even just in the normal interacting environments. So you can imagine in the school environment where it is a bit more closed. So for me, I would suggest that even now the campaigns on health and hygiene and safety still needs to be expanded upon. There needs to be more awareness. And for me, I would call in the communities, especially the role of churches, because we know Kenya is a praying nation, and the church plays a very big role in terms of contributing to the attitudes and the behaviors of people within the community. So I think these can even be points where the stakeholders, including especially the Ministry of Education, as the one that is taking charge of education, obviously, to coordinate with these institutions, right, and use them as soft landings. Yes, churches and community areas where you have community gatherings, and use those as beginning or entry points where this awareness can be created, so that we don't wait until September, and then in September is when we say, okay, our kids are here, and these are the measures we have put in place, and now welcome and walk into the school. But these are things that should be second nature for them by the time they walk into the school. And it is not only for the students. These environments, whether it is the churches or other places of social gatherings, should include all the stakeholders, the parents, those support staff in the schools, the teachers who also are parents. So everybody should use those kinds of, I would call them soft landing institutions where we can practice and ease our ways back into learning institutions.
So then quickly, perhaps just talk about the school calendar. We are looking at recommendations that perhaps we need to relook at the calendar, we need to relook the curriculum, because we know examinations are involved. Speak to us from the perspective of a trainer. Are these doable? What are some of the viable options we have as far as the curriculum and the calendar are concerned?
When we look at the calendar, there have been suggestions of opening in September or even opening later. But for me, the bigger question is, what is education? What is education for us? You know, I think the problem that we have had for quite a while, and hence the introduction of the competency-based curriculum, is there's so much focus on exams. It's like education is running away. There's been this anxiety, even when the schools were being shut down. You would always hear these conversations of, when are we going to cover the syllabus? When will the students come back and cover the syllabus? There are even suggestions that when the schools eventually do open, that the focus should be on trying to catch up so that the syllabus can be covered, so then the students can be ready for the exams. But who sets these exams? Exams are set by people. And of course, these are extraordinary circumstances which call for extraordinary measures. So it doesn't mean if the exams were set, that was something that was cast in stone. Exams can always be adjusted. But I think even this situation of the COVID is calling on us to be a little bit more reflective and really look at what is the essence of education. Is it just so that we can get this knowledge and then pour it or regurgitate it in an exam? Education is supposed to make us, and maybe I'm being philosophical here, and rightly so, it's supposed to make us to be positive, contributing members of society. And the challenge that we have been having is we are churning out students who are probably very good in writing exams, although we know we also have incidences where students also don't perform well, but they are good in taking exams. But then when they go out there, if it is in employment, you find the employer saying, oh, they are not ready for the workplace. So I think this is a time for us to step back and actually reflect on what really is education for us. And in this education that is provided, which are the pieces that are really crucial? Right. Because the students have been home now for a couple of months. And what is it that they are gaining? Okay? Whatever it is that they are gaining, is it something that is relevant to them? So this is a time I would suggest for all of us, whether we are in education or including other stakeholders, to really pick out what is key, what is essential for us. Okay. And then also look at what is it that we want to test in these exams. Okay? Yes. And then be very deliberate and really pick on areas that are very important. So for me, the timeline per se is not what is important. It is what is it that is being tested. Right. We really have to reflect on that and pick on what is really key for us to test. Right. What is education for us as a country and as a people? Definitely something to mull over, not just for teachers and learners, but everyone else who's watching here today. But there's something very important you've mentioned that I'd like Mr. Sosion to speak about. Would this then be the litmus test for the CBC? Because we're looking at critical areas of education as opposed to what we keep saying at examination-based education system. Mr. Sosion, you've also said that examinations are not a matter of life and death. So then will this then be the true test
of the CBC that we are trying to launch in the country?
Well, indeed, I hope you are not trying to push me so that we discuss the CBC. All curricula make sense in any country, and every nation must review its curriculum to meet the challenges and needs of the time. But with respect to examinations, and we have said, it is not a ticket to heaven. Examinations that we have at the moment is merely a summative evaluation of the curriculum of the instructional period that the learners have gone through over time. For primary, it is 8 years, and for secondary, it is 4 years. And the final exam is merely a summative exam that tests different things, practical areas, theoretical areas, and several other areas. And for me and for us, it is not an urgent thing that we must compel schools to open when there is a serious pandemic and outbreak. We can reorganize the entire school curriculum and push matters forward. The KCSE and KCPE obtaining for the current cohorts of candidates can be taken early in the year or even middle in the year, because we don't know how long this disease will take. And to contextualize in terms of the curriculum, I would like to invite Kenyans to deal with the current challenge. And I think this is a time, and I agree with Daktari, and this is a time to instantly and promptly reflect on the nature of our curriculum with respect to COVID-19. When we resume, whether it's September or after September, the learning environment will be different. We will be conducting teaching and learning in a completely different environment. And that, therefore, it invites us, the school management and the ministry must address the aspects of infrastructure and prepare for the class sizes, consider the sanitizers, and several other things. That is another investment line on its own, which must be done from now, so that within these 3 months, that is done. Number two, we must also look at integrating the COVID-19 in the curriculum across all the teaching subjects. That means the Kenya Institute of Curriculum and Development must work and burn the midnight oil and ensure that that is integrated in the curriculum in all our learning institutions across the Republic. And then number three, we must also reschedule our teaching and our calendar to accommodate the new development in the change curriculum. The fact is, we shall deliver a different curriculum in a different environment. And then thirdly, what do we do with the teachers so that we equip them with the pedagogy? They must be trained. They must be prepared so that they are the ones, the frontline officers who will deliver the curriculum in this environment. They are the ones who will be expected to enforce the health protocols within schools. They are the ones who will be expected to provide the psychosocial support to the learners, because that is, in essence, the requirement of any teacher. And therefore, that means within this period, we expect some intensive training and preparation of teachers, because then teachers will be joining the healthcare personnel in this war. This is a war of all of us. We shall need to prepare parents, to prepare everyone, to prepare all the school stakeholders, and therefore we must skill and retool teachers. I agree. We cannot sit and watch the CAF as communities or as the community of this nation. And particularly, I'm inviting all teachers, wherever they are. The nurses, the doctors are working very hard in the health centers. But we see Kenyans not complying with the health protocols that have been put in place. Either they're not keeping their social distance. We see Kenyans are actually mingling without observing this particular rule. Are they using masks? Are they sanitizing? And these are things that we need very intensive campaign and sustained education within our communities. Before, we cannot wait for schools to open, and we cannot wait for the disease to spike. We must, at the moment, and we urge every teacher, now that we are not teaching, our teaching should be that of COVID-19, and our students should be members of our immediate communities, wherever we are. And this is what we need to do. What are the intervention measures that we need to do? And we need to drive this in an orderly manner. We have seen rollout of various campaigns and teaching programs. And we think at this point, to help the government, to help the Ministry of Health, to help the health workers, there are little things that are very great that we can do within the community so that we can help in flattening the curve, either at the right time or early enough. There's a lot that we need to do. And of course, the defeat of COVID-19 is through integrated approach. We need everyone. And particularly, once we've understood the diseases has been explained to us by the health experts, then the rest will be easy for us, even as we plan to resume schools. It will not be enough to subject students to put on masks, to sanitize. We'll need to do a lot and go beyond. And there's a lot that needs to be done in integrating the COVID in the curriculum, equipping teachers with the pedagogy, and preparing thoroughly for a new learning environment in our school system.
Just before I let you go, if we are to go by the recommendations that NAT and the other bodies made, 15 learners per class, we are talking about entirely relooking at infrastructure in more than half of schools in this country if we are to accommodate only 15 learners per class. If we are working with September as the opening month, one, is this enough time for the government to carry out all these recommendations? Because like we said in the last time you were here, it's an expensive venture. You're in the Education Committee. When we're talking about budgetary process this year, perhaps next week, what do we need to see get into the pockets, perhaps, or the accounts for the education sector?
Fundamentally, if we are thinking of taking back to the students and teachers to schools, then we must prepare financially. And that is why if you look at our report, we've recommended an economic stimulus package to the education sector, because we shall have to reconfigure the sitting arrangements and the spacing. The protocol from the World Health is very clear that we keep a distance of 1.5 meters. That means we have to reconfigure the sitting spacing in our classes. It is not a choice. It must be 1.5. And looking at the situation that we have in Kenya, high enrollment rate in our classrooms and large classes, then it means we have to reduce the class sizes, either by teaching using shifts or by putting up more classrooms or emergency tents or whatever that can be done. It is not a choice. It is a must do. And therefore, that is why the ministry must access more funding so that within these 3 months, the ministry and the boards of management of our learning institution can reconfigure the accommodation of learners in terms of class sizes and in terms of numbers and in whatever method that will be used, so that learners are comfortable during learning and we maintain what we call social distance, and therefore it calls for funding. It can be done, it should be done. It's about our children. We have seen globally what is happening within classes and in many developed economies. And that has been done very well, keeping the social distance in the classrooms and maintaining desks 1.5 meters apart. That has been done. We should be able to do it if we care about the health of learners. If you look at our schools, congestions in dormitories and congestions in classrooms, and this congestion is a big possible source of threat of spread of the disease.
Yes.
And therefore, ensuring that the school infrastructure and sitting arrangement and configuring the classroom sitting arrangement is critical in ensuring, because in the checklist of World Health Organization and UNESCO,
yes,
goal number 1 is the safety of teachers and learners.
All right, Mr.
We
Sisi.
cannot achieve safety of teachers and learners if we don't ensure that we sustain the acceptable distance between learners, even in classrooms.
All right.
We
All right.
must prepare for it when we resume schools.
All right. Quite comprehensive there, economic stimulus package for the education sector. Perhaps it would be one of the recommendations made when the task force delivers its report to the Ministry of Health, perhaps the CS, Professor George Magoha. But when we talk about safety, Dr. Githinji, among the key questions that have been raised, especially by parents, are about schools that are currently being used as quarantine centers. How then do we reverse them to be a safe and suitable environment for students, teachers, and all other stakeholders, perhaps the school community?
Before I comment on that, maybe let me very quickly also, respond to something that Sosien talked about
Yes.
the economic rescue for schools.
Go ahead.
I think that it is very important that even as we consider economic rescue for schools, we consider economic rescue for vulnerable households. I've talked to many parents who are really afraid about how their fees is going to be used and they have lost their jobs and what happens. So it is important that as the government plans for this, we have seen this happening. Even when Ebola happened in West Africa and Sierra Leone had a problem. So this is not the first time that we are actually shutting down schools, across many countries. But in the return, we saw actually a waiver of school fees or even partial waiver of school fees for vulnerable communities, especially the ones that can't afford fees and have difficulties, and then maybe they have now lost their livelihoods because of COVID. That consideration needs to be in the return to school formula as well. So let me talk about what you've asked about decontaminating any facility. I am aware that there was a big plan to use schools and colleges for isolation facilities. There was a step back from that plan, but there may be some that were still used. But the larger scalable plan of using these facilities were actually resisted, and I think there was a step back, there was a step taken back. Remember that we've not had a lot of people in isolation or quarantine, not too many. So those few facilities that may have held people who were positive will need to, a decontamination plan. And of course, there is a whole plan, with the Ministry of Health, and that's recommended by WHO, using chlorine-based bleaches and decontamination, and then looking at waste disposal, and looking at the level of usage and whether there are still people in those facilities. And if there are still people, from the time the last person leaves to the time the schools reopen, all those things need to be considered because of the longevity of the virus. And therefore, they have to be decontaminated. But my belief is that not many institutions, going by the numbers that we have actually been used for these for these purposes. But we know that during the quarantine phase, that many people actually were put up in, I remember Lenana School was holding people in quarantine. So they need to be considered one by one. The ministry needs to provide the existing protocol for decontamination and to ensure that they are safe for learners to come back. But there is one point I want to point out also about the vulnerabilities. And now I'm going out of your question because I don't know how much time we have, but I thought this is important to talk about.
Yeah.
That there will be existing expanding inequalities as people come back. Remember that less girls are likely to come back to school than went out. So I hope the plan also considers tracing who came back, who did not come back, and the ones who didn't come back, that the Ministry of Education, working with other ministries, knows exactly why they didn't come back. We are afraid that things like female genital mutilation may rise, early child marriage, there may be children who won't come back because their parents lost their job, they don't have the means to bring them back. Those things need to be considered, especially because we know girls and women face, in disproportionate vulnerabilities. And I hope the plan actually has a gender lens to ensure that that is part and parcel of the return to school formula.
Perhaps Doc also speak about what Dr. Wakiaga mentioned earlier on starting early on awareness, not just for students, but also for every other person who is participatory in the community, in the school community. Should we start now so that when it gets to September, whatever month we decide to open schools, they're getting right into it and knowing exactly what to expect when they get to schools? I'm not sure.
Or Dr. Githinji.
Yeah, Dr. Githinji, sorry, that's Dr. Githinji.
Okay, so in terms of preparation, sorry about that. I thought you were asking Wakiaga to comment.
No problem.
You see, we have a lot, as I've talked about. We have so much to be done. If we are talking about September, remember that between now and September, we have only 3 months. Those 3 months, if the team that is dealing with the return to work formula, including Sosion, if I was to be asked to give my penny's worth of advice, I would say that number one, they need to continue engaging stakeholders. Remember that in many countries where schools, learners have gone back to school, there has been a challenge of reluctant parents. And in some countries, you find that only 50% of the kids, of the learners, go back to school because some parents are not sure they need to return their kids to school. They're seeing numbers, rising. The children or the learners are living with parents who are above 60 years, and the parents are not fully reassured that if the kids go back to school and maybe they're day school, they're not going to bring the disease home. So there's a lot of stakeholder engagement. I don't think the report is the end of it. I know there was public participation, but that should not be the end of it. I think there should be continued engagement of stakeholders between now and when the schools open. The second thing is that full assessment of all schools to ensure they have wash facilities or water and sanitation facilities, and if those that don't have, there's a plan to provide them, including the government and the Ministry of Water and Sanitation, ensuring there is a budget to ensure every school has those facilities, and they can use local communities to ensure that these are done. The other thing is vulnerabilities, ensuring that there is the education officers start to monitor families and ensure they know exactly where the learners are, especially girls, to ensure they know where they are and they have talked to their parents and they're sure that kids are going back to school. The next thing is what we talked about decontamination. And the final thing I would like to say is a plan to prepare, as I talked about, a module on COVID-19, age appropriate, to be embedded for the first or second week to ensure that learners don't go back to school and get back where they stopped. There is psychosocial, there is a mental health issue that needs to be addressed. Is there a plan within the return to school formula that addresses the mental health issue of learners and their families? And then the final thing is that issue of ensuring that the schools have the capacity, and if the capacity is not there, as Honorable Sosiana talked about, considering differential return, that actually if you don't have enough, if the government doesn't have enough money to build new facilities, which I think is going to be very difficult to do in 3 months unless we are doing makeshift facilities, considering differential return, that you can have certain grades go on Monday, certain grades go on Tuesday, but then you have a challenge with boarding schools and dormitories as indicated. Remember, in some of the countries, like Spain, we've seen extreme, many cases rising from dormitories, people sharing common, sleeping areas, the sanitation. Those things need to be checked. So the report is not the end of it. Actually, the report is the beginning of the work, is what I would say.
I'd like us to quickly rush through policy issues. If there's something COVID-19 has exposed, issues especially to do with how we teach in schools, how we do things, be it in higher learning institutions, secondary schools, primary schools. We had heard about a digital program for students, free laptops for students. These are the things that would have come in handy now, but it's not happening. Looking at policy issues, what do we need to change going forward? Dr. Wakiaga, I hope you've been able to... Can you hear me, Dr. Wakiaga?
Oh, yes, Akisa.
Great.
Thank you. You didn't mention anyone, so I didn't know if it was to me.
My apologies for that. And you speak on that, perhaps, is it time to integrate ICT in our education system?
ICT integration should have been integrated yesteryear, yesterdecade. This is a conversation that its time has even passed. And we remember that the laptop project was supposed to have been implemented. This would have been really an ideal time to have come in to kind of cover the whole in terms of learning. And we wouldn't have had a lot of teething problems as we are having right now. But so as it may, we are here. and how best do we make of the situation that we are currently in. We also have to be realistic in terms of the resources that are available, because we can't cry over spilt milk. So right now, our students are at home, and we also have to remember, if we are talking about issues of access and equity, when we look at how learning is going on, we know that for private schools mainly, learning has been going on. But once again, we also have to remember, private schools are tiered. You know, there are the high cost private schools and then the lower cost private schools. So actually the higher cost private schools, that's where we find a lot of learning taking place, because they are better resourced in terms of technology. But then when you look at the private schools that don't have a lot of resources, they're also just struggling as many public schools. But in spite of all this, we also have good stories through all these challenges. Like I was talking with a parent recently in a public school, and they decided to take matters into their hands. And you know, this parent has a child who is in class 8, and they need to be preparing for the exams, but nothing seemed to have been happening. So they, as parents, decided to come together and set up Zoom for their standard 8 classes. So they got together and decided that they were going to empower the teachers and teach them how to use Zoom, so that the teachers can be able to continue providing that learning support to their children. So for me, when I hear these kinds of success stories, they warm my heart, because then I see that there are parents who are willing to collaborate and plug in, that's the word, to plug in where there are gaps. But there needs to be better supports for the parents, so that they don't feel like it is such an uphill task. So then I would suggest that the Ministry of Education to have a kind of more formalized structure, and especially through the heads of schools, because the heads of schools should be playing a more active role. How are they then empowered, so that they can empower the teachers and they can empower the parents? And this particular parent that I was talking with is a parent who is a more, can I say, more exposed parent, who just didn't want to sit. But you know, we also have parents who are in what we call the vulnerable or the low socioeconomic status, who then don't have that confidence and self-efficacy to be able to take matters into their hands. Number one, maybe because of their previous experiences when they were in school. Number two, because they are also having to battle between providing for their families or staying at home and thinking, oh, what are some of the best ways I can work with my school to help my learners? So you find that in these kinds of situations, these kinds of parents are not empowered. And so how can they be empowered so that they can also play a more active role? And so when we look at the issues of technology, coming back to your question, there are various approaches and using all contextualizing technology. You know, if it is in an environment that can be able to have a particular kind of technology, how best can that be harnessed so that it is not only those who maybe seem like the haves are the ones who learning is continuing for them, but then we also look at the vulnerable populations and then look at what technologies can best be harnessed so that they can be able to help their so that the learners can continue learning. So if it is in the rural areas or even if it is in the urban areas of lower socioeconomic status, you know, even get the corporate companies to come in. I know right now Safaricom is doing a very good job, and I'm not trying to promote them here, but I know that they are working with higher education institutions to provide subsidized bundles so that students can be able to get certain bandwidth in terms of Wi-Fi or data bundles, so to speak, so that they can be able to get their education online.
Okay.
So can these kinds of approaches also be taken to the grassroots level or the vulnerable populations and give them subsidized connectivity, so that education can continue for them? If Wi-Fi cannot be an option, then can you effectively use radio, effectively use other technological approaches?
Okay, Dr. Kiaga, very good thoughts there. I'd like us to quickly take a short break. Remember, you can be part of this conversation. There is a Zoom ID on your screen. We'll also be taking in your questions from slido.com. I can see a lot of questions on Twitter for each of the panelists. So let's take a quick break. When we get back, I'll be having our panelists respond to all the questions. If you're a parent, what concerns do you have for your child when it comes to reopen of schools? If you're a teacher, what concerns do you have? Alana, pose those questions. I'll be asking our panelists to try as much as they can to answer them comprehensively, even as we await that report in 2 days. Let's take that break. We'll be back with more. You're watching The Front Row.